Found someone else. Deal with it. No apology. No explanation. Just a business decision delivered to the woman who had built his life alongside him for 2 decades. Her husband expected a frantic call. He expected begging. He might have even hoped for a scene. Instead, Rebecca read the message, set her phone down, and typed back a single word that would eventually haunt his entire legal team. Finally, he thought he was the one walking away. He didn't realize he was walking into a trap that had been set months before that text ever left his phone. A phone vibrates in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the kind of quiet moment most people would forget, except this one carried a message that would end 22 years of marriage in a single sentence. I found someone else. Deal with it. No explanation, no hesitation, no apology. Just a clean break delivered like a business decision. For over 2 decades, Rebecca Carter had built a life beside a man she believed she understood. A man who shared her home, her routines, her history, and yet in that instant, he became someone else entirely. There was no warning that morning, no argument the night before, no dramatic unraveling that could prepare a person for what was about to happen. Just silence, followed by that message, and the realization that everything she thought was stable had already been replaced. Most people expect heartbreak to sound loud, to feel chaotic, to come with tears or shouting. But this was different. This was quiet, controlled, and final. Like a door closing in a house she didn't realize she no longer owned. What makes this story unsettling isn't just what he said, but what happened next. Because Rebecca didn't respond the way most people would expect. There was no desperate call, no emotional reply, no attempt to fix what had just been broken. Instead, she read the message, paused, and sent back a single word that would later leave even his own lawyer confused. Finally, it wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was something else entirely, something measured, something that suggested this moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. And while he moved forward, confident in his decision, believing he had taken control of his future, Rebecca was already steps ahead, quietly putting into motion a plan that had been forming long before that message ever appeared on her screen. 3 days later, the tone shifted. His confidence turned into confusion, and confusion quickly turned into urgency, because the calls didn't come from her. They came from his lawyer. At first, he thought it was routine, paperwork, logistics, the kind of formal process that follows a separation. But the calls didn't stop, and the questions weren't simple. Accounts that once existed no longer showed balances. Access he assumed he had was suddenly restricted. Documents he never paid attention to were now being brought into focus, and each one told a story he didn't expect. Within 72 hours, everything he believed was secure began to disappear piece by piece. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more precise. And that's when reality started to settle in. This wasn't a reaction. This wasn't someone scrambling to recover from betrayal. This was an execution. Every decision she made carried a level of detail that doesn't happen overnight, and every move pointed to one uncomfortable truth he hadn't considered. Rebecca Carter had been preparing. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about a marriage ending. It's a story about control, about patience, and about what happens when someone you underestimate has been paying attention far longer than you realize. The message may have ended the relationship, but it didn't start the story, and it certainly didn't finish it. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in that moment of certainty, is that the life he was walking away from had already begun to shift in ways he wouldn't understand until it was too late. The story doesn't begin with the message, and it doesn't end with the silence that followed. It stretches across years of shared routines, quiet compromises, and decisions that seemed small at the time but would later carry weight neither of them fully understood. Rebecca Carter and Michael Carter built what most people would call a solid life, the kind that looks complete from the outside, filled with milestones, stability, and the comfort of familiarity. There were photographs that captured anniversaries, vacations, birthdays, moments that told a story of consistency and partnership, and for a long time that story appeared real. But what those images never showed were the subtle shifts, the changes in tone, the distance that grew slowly enough to go unnoticed until it became normal. And somewhere in that quiet progression, something began to change, something that would eventually lead to a message that felt sudden, but in truth was anything but. How does a man walk away from everything and end up with nothing? That question didn't come immediately, not in the moment he sent the message, and not even in the hours that followed. At first, there was confidence in his decision, a belief that he had taken control, that he had stepped into a new chapter on his own terms. But as the days unfolded, that sense of certainty began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that the foundation he thought he was standing on was no longer there. Accounts didn't respond the way they used to. Access points that once felt automatic now required verification. Conversations that should have been simple became complicated, layered with details he had never paid attention to before. And as each piece revealed itself, the question became harder to ignore, because nothing about what was happening felt accidental. Was this revenge, or something far more calculated? It would be easy to assume emotion played the biggest role, to believe that Rebecca reacted out of hurt, that everything that followed was driven by the shock of betrayal. But the timing didn't support that. The precision didn't support that. There was a level of organization, a sense of structure behind every move, that suggested something far more deliberate. This wasn't a reaction built in days or even weeks. This was something that had been forming quietly, patiently, long before Michael ever made his decision. And that realization began to change the narrative entirely, because it meant that while he thought he was stepping ahead, he may have already been behind. And the biggest question, the one that would linger long after the details started to surface, was whether Rebecca Carter took back what was hers, or whether she crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Because the difference between reclaiming control and going too far isn't always clear, especially when the actions themselves are measured, legal, and carefully executed. From the outside, it can look like balance being restored, like fairness finding its way back into a situation that had become uneven. But from another perspective, it can feel like something more, something that raises questions about intention, about timing, and about how long someone has been preparing for a moment like this. And as the story continues, those questions don't get simpler. They become sharper, more defined, and harder to answer with certainty. This is a true story, one shaped by betrayal, power, and the kind of decisions that don't just change relationships, but redefine them entirely. Every moment that follows builds on what has already been set in motion, and every detail brings us closer to understanding not just what happened, but why it unfolded the way it did. Because in situations like this, the truth isn't always found in the moment everything falls apart. It's found in everything that led up to it, in the choices that were made quietly, consistently, and without attention until suddenly they become impossible to ignore. To everyone on the outside, Michael Carter and Rebecca Carter were the definition of success, the kind of couple people quietly compared their own lives to without ever saying it out loud. They lived in a comfortable suburban neighborhood, the kind where every lawn was trimmed, every driveway held a reliable car, and every home told a story of stability. Their weekends looked familiar, backyard gatherings with friends, laughter that carried easily, conversations that felt effortless. There were framed photos lining the walls, capturing years of shared experiences, anniversaries marked with quiet celebration, family moments that seemed untouched by conflict. If you asked anyone who knew them, they would have told you the same thing, that Michael and Rebecca had built something solid, something lasting, something that worked. And for a long time, that belief wasn't questioned, not by their friends, not by their neighbors, and not even by Michael himself. Michael Carter was driven in a way that commanded attention. He understood numbers, strategy, and opportunity, and he approached life with the same mindset he brought into business. He expanded, he invested, he calculated risks, and more often than not, those risks paid off. To those around him, he was the architect of their success, the one who pushed forward, who made the big decisions, who ensured that everything continued to grow. But what people didn't always notice was the structure behind that growth, the quiet consistency that allowed everything to function without interruption. Rebecca Carter didn't compete for attention. She didn't need recognition to validate her role, but she was always present, always aware, always maintaining the balance that kept their life from unraveling under the weight of ambition. He built the empire, but she quietly held it together, managing the details, observing the patterns, and understanding the rhythm of their life in ways that went unnoticed. Over time, the changes didn't arrive all at once. They came gradually, almost quietly, in ways that could be explained away if someone wasn't paying close attention. Michael started staying out later, at first for work, or at least that was the explanation that made sense. The calls became more frequent, but shorter, more guarded, conversations that ended as soon as Rebecca entered the room. There were moments where his attention seemed elsewhere, where responses came delayed, where presence turned into distance without a clear reason. It wasn't enough to raise immediate concern, not enough to start an argument, but it was enough to be noticed by someone who had spent years understanding the smallest shifts in his behavior. And Rebecca noticed. She didn't confront him right away. She didn't react impulsively. She simply paid attention, storing each detail, each inconsistency, each moment that didn't align with the man she had known for over 2 decades. The distance between them didn't announce itself. It settled in quietly, reshaping their interactions in ways that felt subtle at first, but became harder to ignore over time. Conversations grew shorter, shared routines became less consistent, and the sense of connection that once felt automatic began to require effort that only one of them seemed willing to give. Michael moved forward as if nothing had changed, maintaining appearances, keeping the structure of their life intact on the surface, while beneath it, something was shifting. Rebecca didn't chase answers. She didn't demand explanations. But she watched, and in watching, she began to understand that what she was seeing wasn't temporary. It wasn't stress. It wasn't distraction. It was something else entirely. Something that suggested a separation had already begun long before it was ever spoken out loud. And then, one day, Rebecca Carter noticed something small. Something so easy to overlook that most people would have dismissed it without a second thought. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. But it didn't belong. And in that moment, everything she had quietly observed began to connect in a way that could no longer be ignored. That small detail didn't just raise a question. It changed the direction of everything that followed, because it confirmed what she had been sensing all along, that the life she thought she was living was already being replaced, piece by piece, without her being told. For the moment Rebecca Carter noticed that small detail, she didn't react the way most people would. She didn't confront Michael Carter. She didn't ask questions. And she didn't allow emotion to take control of her next move. Instead, she became more attentive, more deliberate, and far more aware of everything happening around her. What started as a quiet observation quickly turned into a pattern. And patterns have a way of revealing truths that words often try to hide. The phone that used to sit openly on the table was now turned face down more often than not. Messages would appear briefly, then disappear before they could be read. There were names she didn't recognize, notifications that came at unusual hours, and a growing sense that communication was happening just out of reach. None of it was undeniable on its own, but together, it formed something far more difficult to dismiss. The changes extended beyond his phone. There were transactions that didn't align with their usual spending, charges that seemed out of place, subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion but consistent enough to stand out over time. Dinners that were explained as business meetings appeared more frequently, and the timing didn't always make sense. There were gaps in his schedule, stretches of time that couldn't be clearly accounted for, and explanations that felt rehearsed rather than real. Rebecca didn't interrupt the process. She didn't interfere. She simply continued to observe, allowing the details to build naturally. And as they did, the picture became clearer, more defined, and harder to ignore. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a temporary distraction. It wasn't a mistake that could be explained away. It was structured, intentional, and sustained. It wasn't just an affair. It was a completely different life. One that existed parallel to the one he came home to, carefully separated, carefully maintained, and hidden in plain sight. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled in gradually. But once it was there, it didn't leave. Every late night, every guarded conversation, every unexplained decision began to align with a truth that no longer needed confirmation. And still, Rebecca remained quiet. Not because she didn't understand what was happening, but because she understood it too well. Reacting too early would only disrupt what was revealing itself. and she had already begun to recognize that timing would matter more than anything else. When the message finally came, it didn't introduce anything new. It confirmed what had already been established, what had already been understood without being spoken. I found someone else. Deal with it. The words were direct, almost detached, as if they carried no weight beyond their meaning. There was no hesitation behind them, no indication that they were difficult to send. And for a moment, everything paused. Not because Rebecca was surprised, but because the moment she had anticipated had finally arrived. Silence followed, the kind that allows a person to decide not what they feel, but what they will do next. And in that silence, there was no confusion, no panic, no visible reaction that matched the situation. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for the phone to demand answers or to hold on to something that had already been let go. Instead, she responded with a single word, one that carried more meaning than anything else she could have said in that moment. Finally. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't impulsive, it was controlled, deliberate, and final in its own way. Because for Rebecca Carter, this wasn't the beginning of something falling apart. It was the confirmation that everything she had been preparing for was now in motion. And while Michael Carter moved forward believing he had taken control of the situation, believing he had made the defining decision, what he didn't realize was that the outcome had already begun to shift in ways he hadn't considered. Because what Michael didn't know, what he hadn't taken the time to see, was that Rebecca Carter had already made her move. The shift didn't happen with noise or confrontation, it happened quietly, in a way that made it almost invisible until it was already complete. In the first 24 hours after that message, nothing seemed unusual from the outside. Michael Carter went about his routine with the confidence of someone who believed he had already taken control of the situation. He assumed the process would unfold the way it usually does, conversations, negotiations, a gradual separation where he would still maintain access to the life he had built. But what he didn't realize was that while he was moving forward, Rebecca Carter had already moved ahead, and she wasn't waiting for permission or discussion to begin. The groundwork had been laid long before that message was ever sent, and now it was being activated with precision. By the second day, the first signs appeared, subtle at first, but enough to create confusion. A routine login didn't go through the way it normally would. A transaction required additional verification. Accounts that had always been accessible suddenly felt distant, as if something had shifted just beyond his reach. It wasn't immediate panic, not yet, just a sense that something wasn't aligning the way it should. He told himself it was temporary, a technical issue, something that could be resolved with a call or a reset. But the pattern didn't correct itself, it expanded. Each attempt to regain access revealed another layer, another barrier, another detail he had never needed to think about before. And as those layers continued to appear, the situation began to take on a different shape, one that felt less like an inconvenience and more like a controlled restriction. Within 72 hours, everything Michael Carter thought he owned was no longer his. Not taken in a dramatic sense, not removed through force or confrontation, but repositioned in a way that left him without control. Joint accounts had been restructured with legal backing he hadn't fully considered. Financial pathways that once ran freely were now redirected, secured, and documented. Assets that existed under shared authority were now operating under conditions he couldn't bypass. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't random, it was organized, deliberate, and supported by a framework that made it difficult to challenge without stepping into a process he wasn't prepared for. And that's when the calls started, not from Rebecca, but from his lawyer, trying to understand what had already been set in motion. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't something built in response to a single moment. There were records, documents, agreements that had been reviewed, updated, and positioned over time. Rebecca Carter hadn't just been aware of their financial structure. She had understood it in detail, quietly ensuring that every element could function independently if it ever needed to. There were signatures in place that allowed for changes under specific conditions, clauses that had seemed routine at the time but now carried weight, and documentation that reflected a level of preparation Michael had never questioned. He had trusted the system because it had always worked, but he had never stopped to consider who truly understood it. This wasn't about a sudden decision or an emotional reaction. It was about awareness built over years, about paying attention to details that most people overlook, about recognizing that stability isn't just about what you have, but about how it's structured. Rebecca didn't act quickly because she didn't need to. She had already done the work, already positioned herself in a way that allowed her to move without hesitation when the time came. And now that time had arrived, everything unfolded exactly as it had been set up to. The control Michael thought he had wasn't taken from him in a single moment. It was revealed to have been shared in ways he never fully understood. She wasn't reacting. She was executing a plan. The deeper the situation was examined, the harder it became to explain it as coincidence or timing. What initially looked like a sudden shift in control began to reveal something far more structured, something that had been developing quietly over a long period of time. Rebecca Carter didn't just prepare for a divorce. She prepared for betrayal. That realization didn't come from a single document or a single decision. It came from the pattern that connected everything together. Every account adjustment, every clause, every authorization had a purpose, and when those pieces were placed side by side, they formed a clear and deliberate strategy. This wasn't about reacting to what Michael Carter had done. It was about anticipating it long before it ever happened, and ensuring that when it did, she wouldn't be left vulnerable. There were records that told the story without emotion, documentation that showed a timeline of awareness rather than a moment of discovery. Financial statements had been reviewed with more attention than Michael had ever given them. Agreements that once seemed routine had been revisited, clarified, and secured in ways that allowed flexibility under specific conditions. Rebecca had taken the time to understand not just what they owned, but how it functioned, how it could be protected, and how it could be repositioned if necessary. There were legal consultations that had taken place quietly, not in response to an event, but as a precaution against one. Nothing about what she had done required urgency, because it had never been rushed. It was built slowly, carefully, and with a level of patience that made it almost impossible to detect from the outside. She had documented everything, not in a way that felt excessive, but in a way that ensured clarity. Conversations, financial movements, patterns of behavior, all recorded with a purpose that only became clear when the situation reached its breaking point. It wasn't about gathering evidence for confrontation. It was about creating a structure that could stand on its own if it ever needed to. And when that moment arrived, when Michael sent that message believing he was taking control, every one of those details shifted from preparation to action. The system didn't need to be built. It was already in place, waiting to be used exactly as intended. When the situation moved into a legal setting, the tone changed again. What had been confusion and urgency on one side became structure and clarity on the other. Lawyers didn't argue over emotion. They worked through documentation, through agreements, through the framework that had been established long before the separation was made official. Michael Carter expected resistance, expected negotiation, expected some level of compromise that would allow him to regain control of what he believed was his. But what he encountered instead was a system that had already accounted for the outcome. Every asset, every account, every decision was supported by documentation that aligned with legal standards, leaving very little room for interpretation. The arguments that took place weren't about who deserved what, they were about what had already been defined. Each attempt to challenge the structure was met with evidence that reinforced it. Each effort to shift the outcome revealed another layer of preparation that had been put in place long before any of this began. And as the process unfolded, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't a situation driven by emotion. It was one shaped by foresight. Rebecca Carter hadn't waited for things to fall apart before taking action. She had ensured that if they ever did, she would already be in a position to protect herself fully. In the end, the law didn't see revenge. It saw preparation. That distinction mattered because it changed how everything was interpreted. What might have appeared personal on the surface was recognized as structured and deliberate within the legal framework. There was no indication of impulsive action, no evidence of decisions made in the heat of the moment. Instead, there was consistency, clarity, and a level of organization that aligned with long-term planning rather than short-term reaction. And that realization shifted the balance completely, because it confirmed what had been building throughout the entire situation, that this outcome wasn't created in response to a single message, It was the result of years of quiet understanding, careful positioning, and the decision to be ready long before it was necessary. By the time everything settled, the numbers had been reviewed, the documents had been finalized, and the structure of their shared life had been fully dismantled. What remained wasn't defined by what Rebecca Carter had taken, but by what she chose to leave behind. It wasn't the assets that carried the most weight, it wasn't the accounts or the legal outcomes that marked the end of the story. It was the absence of everything that once gave those things meaning. It was what she left behind. The house that once held years of shared history no longer represented a home. It became just another asset processed and reassigned. The money that had once symbolized success and security was reduced to figures, distributed and controlled with precision. And the relationship that had existed for over 2 decades, the foundation that everything else had been built on, was no longer something that could be repaired, explained, or revisited. It was finished in a way that didn't leave room for interpretation. For Michael Carter, the outcome didn't arrive all at once. It revealed itself over time, piece by piece, as the reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. The financial loss was clear, measurable, something that could be calculated and understood on paper, but what followed extended beyond numbers. The reputation he had built, the image of control and success that defined him, began to shift as the details of what had happened circulated quietly among those who knew him. There were no dramatic announcements, no public statements, just a gradual awareness that the life he once presented was no longer intact. And with that awareness came distance. Conversations changed, interactions became less certain, and the confidence he once carried started to fade under the weight of what he had lost. What remained was isolation, not imposed from the outside, but formed through the realization that control, once assumed, had never been as complete as he believed. Rebecca Carter's outcome looked different, not because it was defined by victory, but because it was defined by resolution. There was no need for celebration, no moment where everything paused to acknowledge what had been achieved. Instead, there was a sense of stillness, a return to control that didn't require validation from anyone else. The preparation, the patience, the decisions that had been made quietly over the years had led to a position where she was no longer dependent on circumstances she couldn't influence. What she gained wasn't just financial security, it was clarity, the ability to move forward without uncertainty, without waiting for something else to shift. And in that clarity, there was a form of peace that didn't come from the situation itself, but from knowing she had understood it long before it reached its conclusion. Some people break when they're betrayed, their response shaped by the shock of the moment, by the weight of something they didn't see coming. Others prepare, not out of fear, but out of awareness, recognizing that stability isn't guaranteed, that trust doesn't eliminate risk, and that control often depends on what you do before anything goes wrong. Rebecca Carter didn't change the outcome in a single moment. She shaped it over time, through choices that didn't demand attention until they became impossible to ignore. And Michael Carter, in the end, wasn't just facing the consequences of a decision he made, he was confronting the reality of everything he hadn't seen. If you were in her position, would you have walked away, accepted the loss, and started over from nothing? Or would you have done exactly the same, preparing in silence, waiting for the moment when everything aligned, and taking back control in a way that left no room for doubt? Now that you've heard how everything unfolded between Michael Carter and Rebecca Carter, the question isn't just about what happened, it's about how you see it. Situations like this don't come with clear answers, they leave room for interpretation, for perspective, for judgment shaped by personal experience. Some will look at Rebecca's actions and see fairness, a calculated effort to protect herself after years of quiet awareness. Others will see something more severe, a level of preparation that raises questions about how far is too far when trust is broken. And that's what makes stories like this stay with people long after they end, because they don't tell you what to think, they force you to decide. Tell me in the comments, was this justice or revenge? Was Rebecca Carter simply taking back control of a life she helped build? Or did her actions cross a line that shouldn't have been crossed, no matter the circumstances? And if you think this story is shocking, wait until you hear what happened in the next one, because not every situation ends with this level of control, and not every outcome is this calculated. Subscribe for more real stories where the truth is never simple, where every detail matters, and where the line between right and wrong isn't always as clear as it seems.